When we think of the Roman Empire, we conjure images of power, glory, and unparalleled sophistication. We see the legions in their disciplined ranks, the aqueducts snaking across the landscape, and the Colosseum standing as a monument to architectural genius. We speak of the laws that shaped Western civilization, and the philosophy that still echoes in our halls of learning. But tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on this gilded stage. Because for every story of a triumphant general, there was another, far darker story that has been deliberately scrubbed from the popular narrative. It is the story of the boys and young men who were the empire's living, breathing luxury items, whose suffering was the hidden price of all that splendor. These were not just servants. They were male concubines, human beings trapped in a system designed to exploit their youth, beauty, and vulnerability for the pleasure of Rome's elite. To understand this brutal reality, you must first discard any modern notions of consent and coercion. In the rigid hierarchy of Rome, power was the only currency that mattered, and it dictated everything. At the very bottom of this pyramid, even lower than many common slaves, were these young men. Some were barely teenagers, snatched from conquered territories in Greece, Syria, or Gaul. Others were born into slavery, their fate sealed from their first breath. They were selected not for their skills or intelligence, but for a single, chilling purpose: their physical appearance and their perceived ability to provide entertainment and companionship for their masters. They existed in a constant state of uncertainty, a life defined by the whims of another man. They never knew when they might be summoned, what would be expected of them, or how their refusal or their compliance might affect their very survival. The journey into this gilded hell began at the slave market. Imagine a place, not of hushed transactions but of raw, brutal commerce, more akin to a modern livestock auction than anything else. A wealthy Roman aristocrat, perhaps a senator or a powerful merchant, would arrive with his entourage, his gaze sweeping over the assembled stock. Here, boys and young men, stripped bare to expose every detail of their bodies, stood on wooden blocks, shivering not just from the cold, but from sheer terror. Their humanity was erased. They were products, and the buyers were discerning customers. The selection process was a deeply dehumanizing ritual. A potential buyer would walk up, circling the boy, inspecting him with a cold, appraising eye. He would check the quality of his skin, the straightness of his teeth, the musculature of his limbs. He might force the boy's mouth open, run a hand over his hair, or command him to turn around, all while discussing his attributes aloud with his companions. There was no consideration for the abject fear these young men must have felt, standing exposed and vulnerable, while strangers debated their worth in cold, hard currency. A boy's origin was a key selling point, a brand name that promised certain qualities. Young men from Greece were particularly praised for their supposed refinement, education, and slender, artistic builds. Those from the Germanic tribes were valued for their fair complexion, blue eyes, and robust physiques, seen as exotic and untamed. A boy from Syria might be noted for his dark, alluring features. Each origin came with a stereotype, a pre-packaged fantasy for the buyer. Once a price was agreed upon, a handful of coins would be exchanged, and a life would be irrevocably altered. The transaction was swift, impersonal, and absolute. The young man was no longer a person. He was res, a thing, a piece of property. He would be led away from the market, leaving behind the only world he had ever known. His name often changed to something more pleasing to his new owner. He was now an object, a living work of art to be displayed, used, and discarded at his master's will. He entered a household where his life was no longer his own. He was expected to be available at all hours of the day and night, to anticipate his master's needs before they were spoken, and most cruelly to maintain an appearance of willing participation, a cheerful gratitude, regardless of his true feelings. The psychological toll of this existence is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Imagine being forced to smile while enduring treatment that violated every fiber of your being, every aspect of your dignity and autonomy. This was not just a loss of freedom, it was the systematic dismantling of the self, the beginning of a life sentence in a prison made of marble and gold. Once purchased, the young man stepped out of the squalor of the slave market and into a world of bewildering opulence. He might find himself living in a sprawling urban villa where cool air drifted through open courtyards, the sound of fountains trickled from marble statues, and intricate mosaics depicting myths and legends spread across the floors. He would be bathed by other slaves, his skin softened with oils and perfumed with scents from Arabia. He was dressed in fabrics he had only ever dreamed of: fine linen, soft wool, perhaps even silk, imported at enormous cost from the distant East. To an outside observer, it might have seemed as though he had won a lottery. But this was the first and most insidious lie. This was not a home, it was a prison. And the luxury was not a gift. It was the very material from which the bars of his cage were forged. The psychological torment inflicted upon these young men was a masterclass in systematic dehumanization. The core of this torment was absolute uncertainty. The master's mood was the weather system in which the concubine lived, and it could change from sun to storm in an instant. A kind word one moment could be followed by a violent outburst the next. This unpredictability was a deliberate tool of control. It created a state of hypervigilance and constant anxiety, forcing the young man to focus his entire being on reading his master's subtlest cues. His own feelings had to be suppressed until they barely existed. Survival depended on becoming a perfect mirror, reflecting only what the master wished to see. This manipulation was amplified by a cruel technique we would today call intermittent reinforcement. A master might shower his favorite with gifts: a piece of jewelry, a rare fruit, and praise him in front of guests, creating a powerful bond of dependency and a twisted form of gratitude. The boy, starved for kindness, would cling to these moments. But this kindness could be withdrawn in a heartbeat for a perceived slighter moment of sadness, a lack of enthusiasm, a conversation with the wrong person. The subsequent despair would send the boy into a spiral of self-blame, desperately replaying every action to find his mistake, making him even more desperate to win back his master's favor. To ensure his control was absolute, the master enforced a strict policy of isolation. The delicatus occupied a strange position in the household hierarchy. He was not one of the common slaves, who might view him with a mixture of envy for his luxuries and contempt for his role. He was certainly not a member of the family. The mistress of the house, the domina, often saw him as a rival for her husband's attention and resources, a source of profound humiliation. Masters deliberately prevented their concubines from forming friendships. Any bond of solidarity was a threat. This isolation was particularly cruel for young men torn from their families, severing their last connection to their own identity and leaving them utterly dependent on their tormentor. In households with multiple concubines, this psychological warfare reached another level. The master would pit them against each other, openly comparing their looks or talents. They were forced into a silent, venomous competition for privileges. A new favorite's arrival could mean ruin for the old one. This prevented any sense of brotherhood, creating an atmosphere of constant tension and betrayal. The control over their physical existence was just as total. Their bodies were not their own. They were investments to be managed for maximum value. They were subjected to strict dietary regimens and rigorous exercise programs. Their days were scheduled around grooming practices performed by other slaves, the ornators. Body hair was painstakingly removed through painful methods like plucking or using harsh depilatory creams. Even medical care was provided not out of compassion, but as asset protection. A sick or injured concubine was a damaged good. A master would spend money on a doctor, but the doctor's report would be like a mechanic's assessment of a prized chariot. This extended to horrifying cosmetic procedures performed without anesthesia. A master might demand minor surgical alterations to improve his features, performed without the boy's consent, his body treated as a piece of clay to be molded to his owner's aesthetic preferences. The clothing and jewelry they wore were symbols of ownership. Like a prized horse adorned with a fine saddle, the concubine was decorated to display his master's wealth. Beneath the silk and gold, he remained utterly powerless, a living doll in a house of horrors.
The suffering within the walls of a Roman villa was not an isolated phenomenon. Born from the cruelty of a few deviant individuals, it was the end product of a vast and terrifyingly efficient machine, an engine of exploitation fueled by wealth, sanctioned by law, and tolerated by an entire society. To truly understand the plight of the male concubine, we must look beyond the gilded cage and examine the architecture of the system that built it. This was not a secret shame. It was an open industry, and its gears turned on the cogs of the Roman economy and its deeply flawed moral code. The demand from Rome's elite for beautiful young companions created a voracious and highly profitable market. This wasn't a Bacali trade. It was a mainstream pillar of the luxury economy. The immense wealth flowing into Rome from its conquered provinces created a class of aristocrats with an insatiable appetite for status symbols. And a beautiful exotic delicatus was one of the most coveted. This demand created powerful incentives for slave traders who operated vast networks that stretched across the known world. They were the architects of misery, and their business model depended on a constant supply of fresh human flesh. Supply came from several brutal sources. War was the most prolific. Every Roman military victory brought a flood of captives to the markets. Their lives forfeit, their bodies now spoils of war. Kidnapping was also rampant, with pirates and bandits snatching children and young men from coastal villages and remote towns, their families left to wonder forever what had become of them. Perhaps the most tragic path into this life was through debt slavery. In a world with no social safety net, a single failed harvest or a bad business deal could plunge a family into financial ruin. To pay their debts, a father might be forced to make an unthinkable choice: sell one of his sons. This wasn't seen as a monstrous act, but as a grim necessity, a sacrifice of one to save the many. The psychological burden on both the family and the boy himself was devastating, a transaction sealed with shame and lifelong trauma. To prepare these boys for their future roles, specialized training schools existed, operating much like the gladiator schools that prepared men for the arena. Here, any remaining spirit of defiance was systematically broken. Through a brutal regimen of physical conditioning and psychological manipulation, they were taught the arts of pleasing a master. They learned how to serve wine, how to engage in witty conversation, how to play music, and how to submit to any and all physical demands. These institutions were factories, stripping away individuality and producing compliant, attractive, and ultimately broken objects. This entire industry was built upon a foundation of Roman law, which, for all its celebrated complexity, was chillingly simple when it came to slavery. A slave was not a persona, a person with rights. A slave was race, a thing, a piece of property, no different in legal standing from a chair or a chariot. The master, or dominus, held the power of life and death vita nessus potestas over his slaves. He could abuse, torture, or even kill them with near total impunity. An assault on a slave was not a crime against a human being. It was merely damage to property. This legal framework provided the ultimate justification for the system. Rendering the suffering of concubines legally invisible, they had no recourse, no one to appeal to, no court that would hear their case. This legal dehumanization was mirrored by a profound social and moral indifference. The same Roman aristocrats who debated complex questions of virtues, honor honestas, and dignity dignitas in the Senate saw no contradiction in the systematic exploitation happening within their own homes. These lofty ideals were for Roman citizens only. The suffering of a slave, particularly one designated for pleasure, was simply irrelevant to their moral calculations. This reveals a staggering hypocrisy at the heart of Roman society. They could build a world on principles of law and order while simultaneously condoning a system of human trafficking and institutionalized abuse. The normalization of this cruelty had a corrosive effect on the entire culture. A society that could accept the systematic violation of vulnerable young men was a society that could cheer for the slaughter in the Colosseum and justify the brutal suppression of slave revolts. The engine of exploitation didn't just crush its immediate victims. It coarsened the soul of the empire itself. Even in the most oppressive circumstances, the human spirit cannot be entirely extinguished. It flickers in the darkness, seeking any small crack of light. For the male concubines of Rome, trapped in a system designed to annihilate their will, resistance was not found in open rebellion. That was a path to certain and brutal death. Instead, it took the form of small, secret acts of defiance, a quiet war waged for the preservation of the self. This was the resistance of the soul. They became masters of duplicity, expert actors on the stage of their own subjugation. A smile could hide contempt. A word of praise could be laced with silent irony. They learned to navigate the treacherous currents of their masters' moods, not just to survive, but to carve out tiny spaces of autonomy. A feigned illness might win a day of rest, A cleverly misunderstood command might spare them a humiliating task. These were minuscule victories, invisible to their captors, but they were victories nonetheless. They were proof that a mind, even one in a shackled body, could still be free. In the shadows of the great houses, they also formed clandestine networks of support. A shared glance, a subtle gesture, a whispered word in a secluded corridor. These were the threads that wove a fragile tapestry of solidarity. They would warn each other of the master's foul temper, share scraps of food, or offer a moment of silent comfort to one who had been recently abused. These secret alliances were lifelines, reminders that they were not alone in their suffering. Their humanity was still recognized by someone. But sometimes desperation boiled over into overt action. The most dramatic act of defiance was the attempt to escape. It was a desperate gamble against impossible odds. The Roman world was a web of surveillance for a runaway slave. With no money, no papers, and a face that might be known, freedom was a distant dream. The punishments for failure were designed to be a terrifying spectacle. Public floggings, branding with a hot iron on the forehead, or even crucifixion. Yet some still chose to run, preferring the chance of death on their own terms to a life of certain misery. Suicide was the final tragic escape. It was the ultimate act of reclaiming control, a declaration that their body and their life, in the end, belonged only to them. But even this was often denied. A master who had invested a large sum in his delicatus would take measures to prevent the loss of his property, placing the boy under constant watch, denying him any means of self-harm. For those who survived, another enemy awaited: time. The value of a male concubine was inextricably tied to his youth and beauty. As age began to etch lines on his face and soften the contours of his body, his worth plummeted. The master's eye would begin to wander toward newer, younger acquisitions. In the market, the fate of an aging concubine was a bleak postscript to a life of exploitation. Unlike other slaves who might learn a trade and eventually earn or buy their freedom, the concubine's skills were useless outside the gilded cage. Some were simply cast out, abandoned to fend for themselves on the streets of Rome with no resources and no future. Others were sold off to lower status households, where the work was harder and the conditions far worse. Or they were relegated to the ranks of common household slaves, their days of luxury a bitter memory. Their fall was as swift as their initial ascent was arbitrary. What, then, is the legacy of these forgotten victims? It is a legacy of silence. Their voices were erased in their own time, and history has largely kept them muted. We find only fleeting, euphemistic references to them in Roman literature and poetry. We see hints of their existence in the luxurious artifacts excavated from villa smears, perfume bottles, fine jewelry. But their individual stories, their names, their hopes, their fears, these are lost to the ages, buried under the marble. Ruins of the empire that consumed them, yet their silence speaks to us today. It is a chilling reminder that the grand narratives of history are often built upon foundations of unspeakable cruelty, that the price of civilization is frequently paid by its most vulnerable members. Their story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that societies can institutionalize breathtaking inhumanity while simultaneously celebrating ideals of justice, honor, and virtue. The Roman Empire did not collapse because of this single injustice, but the moral corrosion it represented, the acceptance of treating human beings as disposable objects, was a rot at the very core of its foundation. In remembering them, we do more than just fill a gap in the historical record. We honor their resilience and acknowledge their humanity. We are challenged to look at our own world and ask what injustices we choose to ignore, what systems of exploitation we tolerate for our own comfort and convenience. The story of Rome's male concubines is not a relic of a distant, barbaric past. It is a timeless and universal warning about the terrifying consequences of absolute power, the seductive nature of dehumanization, and the enduring human struggle for dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression. Their echoes, though faint, compel us to listen, and to ensure that such a profound silence never again falls over the suffering of so many.